August 15, 1945, Manila, Philippine Islands. The monsoon rains had stopped that morning, leaving the air thick and humid, clinging to the skin like wet cloth. In a compound surrounded by corrugated metal and bamboo fencing on the eastern edge of the city, 23 women sat in silence. Some stared at their hands. Others watched the doorway with eyes that had learned not to hope. The wooden floors beneath them were worn smooth by years of footsteps, soldiers' boots coming and going, always coming and going. Outside, the sound of American jeeps grew louder, their engines a mechanical growl that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Inside, the women did not move. They had learned, above all else, to be still. None of them knew that the war had ended hours before. None of them knew that Emperor Hirohito's voice had crackled across radio waves throughout Japan that very morning, announcing surrender in language so formal that many of his subjects could barely understand it. All the women knew was the sound of different engines, different voices shouting in a language they did not recognize, and the sudden, terrible absence of the Japanese soldiers who had controlled every moment of their existence for months or years. In that silence between one world ending and another beginning, they waited. They had become experts at waiting. When the door finally opened, sunlight poured in like an accusation. The system that brought these women to that room in Manila had been designed with bureaucratic precision and implemented with industrial efficiency. Beginning in 1932 in Shanghai and expanding rapidly after the full-scale invasion of China in 1937, the Imperial Japanese Army had established what they termed comfort stations, a euphemism of such profound dishonesty that it would later become a case study in the manipulation of language for the purpose of obscuring atrocity. The women forced into this system came from across Asia, Korea, China, the Philippines, Indonesia, Burma, and elsewhere. Some were kidnapped outright from their villages. Others were deceived with promises of factory work or nursing positions. Still others were sold by families so desperate with poverty that they had no other choice, believing their daughters would work as seamstresses or cooks, not understanding the true nature of the transaction until it was far too late to matter. By 1945, historians estimate that between 50,000 and 200,000 women had been trapped in this system. The wide variance in numbers itself a testament to how thoroughly the Japanese military had obscured their identities, treating them not as human beings with names and histories, but as supplies to be requisitioned, transported, and consumed. The Japanese military maintained meticulous records of ammunition expenditures, food rations, and fuel consumption, but the women existed in administrative shadows, their suffering unrecorded in official documents, their voices systematically silenced. The military's justification for the system was presented in terms of operational necessity. Following the rape of Nanking in 1937, where Japanese soldiers had murdered an estimated 300,000 Chinese civilians and sexually assaulted tens of thousands of women, the High Command had grown concerned about the Army's international reputation and the spread of venereal disease among troops. The comfort stations were framed as a solution to both problems, a controlled system that would prevent random violence while maintaining troop morale and health. In this framework, the women were not victims, but rather components of military logistics, no different than bullets or bandages. The system's architects convinced themselves they were preventing greater evils, that organized rape was somehow more civilized than disorganized rape, that bureaucratic atrocity was less shameful than spontaneous atrocity. The women themselves understood the truth that the system's administrators refused to acknowledge. There was no comfort in the comfort stations, only survival measured in hours and days. For Kim Sunoke, a Korean woman who had been taken from her village near Pyongyang in 1943 at the age of 16, the journey to Manila had taken 3 weeks. She would later recall, in testimony given to researchers in the 1990s, that she had believed she was being sent to work in a textile factory in Japan. The recruiter had been Korean himself, a man who spoke with the authority of someone working for the Japanese colonial administration. He had papers. He had official stamps. He had promised her family money. She had gone willingly, driven by a daughter's desire to help parents who had not eaten a full meal in weeks. The realization of what had actually happened came in stages, each more horrifying than the last. First, the factory that never appeared. Then, the military transport ship crowded with other girls who shared her confusion and growing fear. Finally, the arrival at a building in Manila where a Japanese officer explained their purpose with bureaucratic detachment, as though he were describing shift rotations in a cannery. Kim Suno-kei would remember that what shocked her most in that moment was not the content of what he said. Her mind had trouble processing words that seemed to describe something impossible, but rather his tone, which suggested he was stating simple facts about the natural order of things. The stations operated with rigid schedules. Enlisted men were typically permitted 30 minutes. Non-commissioned officers received an hour. Officers could stay longer. The women were given numbers, not names. They were subjected to weekly medical examinations that focused entirely on preventing the spread of disease to soldiers, with no concern whatsoever for the women's own health or well-being. Some stations required the women to service 30 to 40 men per day. On weekends or before major military operations, the numbers could double. The physical trauma was compounded by psychological devastation, the systematic destruction of identity, the reduction of self to pure function, the learned helplessness that came from the absolute impossibility of escape. Many women did not survive. Some died from disease or physical trauma. Others took their own lives, choosing death over continuation. Those who survived did so through psychological mechanisms that themselves carried lifelong costs: dissociation, emotional numbing, the construction of internal walls that separated the body being used from the consciousness observing it. Kim Suno-kei would later describe learning to leave her body, to float somewhere near the ceiling, and watch what happened to the girl below as though it were happening to someone else entirely. This splitting of self from flesh became a survival strategy, but it was a strategy that made reassembling a coherent identity after liberation almost impossibly difficult. The women in these stations lived inside a profound paradox. They existed within the Japanese military system. They were transported on military vehicles, housed in military-controlled buildings, subjected to military medical examinations, and yet they were simultaneously erased from that system's official consciousness. They were there and not there, visible and invisible, essential to operations yet unacknowledged in any meaningful way. This ontological ambiguity, this existence in a state of being both utilized and denied, would later make international recognition of their suffering extraordinarily difficult. How does one prove the existence of something that was designed to exist outside the realm of proof? The American soldiers who opened that door in Manila on August 15th had no framework for understanding what they were discovering. The men of the 1st Cavalry Division who first entered the compound had been fighting their way through the Pacific for 3 years. They had seen the aftermath of battles on Guadalcanal and Leyte. They had witnessed the desperation of Japanese soldiers who chose suicide over surrender. They had walked through villages destroyed by artillery and napalm. They considered themselves hardened by war's cruelties, no longer capable of shock. They were wrong. Private First Class Daniel Morrison from Iowa would later write in a letter to his sister, never sent but preserved in his personal effects after his death in 1973, that what disturbed him most was not the physical condition of the women they found, though many showed signs of malnutrition and untreated injuries, but rather their absolute stillness. They didn't cry, he wrote. They didn't smile. They didn't react at all when we came in. It was like they had learned to turn themselves off, like machines when you cut the power. I've never seen anything like it, and I've seen plenty of terrible things in this war. But this was different. This was something we didn't have a name for. The American military in 1945 operated within its own complex relationship to gender and morality. These were men from a society that idealized female purity and domesticity, that had mobilized for war partly under the banner of protecting women and children from fascist aggression. The propaganda they had consumed for years portrayed American fighting men as gallant protectors, fundamentally different from the Japanese enemy, who was depicted in both official and unofficial media as bestial and barbaric. The discovery of the comfort stations created a cognitive crisis for many American servicemen, not because they were naive about sexual violence in war, but because the systematic, bureaucratic nature of what they found seemed to exceed their conceptual boundaries for cruelty. What the American soldiers expected to find in the closing days of the war in the Pacific was straightforward military conflict reaching its conclusion. Japanese soldiers who would either surrender or fight to the death, civilian populations requiring immediate humanitarian aid, infrastructure damaged by combat requiring reconstruction. What they actually found in Manila and dozens of other locations across the Pacific Theater in August and September of 1945 was evidence of a system of sexual slavery so extensive and so methodically organized that it challenged their understanding of modern warfare itself. The women, for their part, had no reason to trust these new soldiers with different uniforms and different faces. Some believed initially that they were simply being transferred to a new set of captors. The concept of liberation existed outside their experiential framework. Kim Suno-kei would recall, decades later, that her first thought upon seeing American soldiers was not hope, but rather calculation about whether these men would be more or less brutal than the Japanese soldiers she had come to know with terrible intimacy. The idea that they might want nothing from her, that they might view her as a victim requiring care rather than as an object available for use, seemed so unlikely as to be not worth considering. The clash between American expectations and Korean, Chinese, Filipino, and Indonesian women's traumatized reality created moments of profound miscommunication. American soldiers offered food, chocolate bars, canned rations, fruit they had requisitioned from local supplies, and were bewildered when women refused or accepted with expressions suggesting they expected payment in the form of their bodies. They offered medical care and were disturbed when women submitted to examinations with the blank compliance of those who had learned that resistance only magnified suffering. They attempted comfort through smiles and gentle words, using translators when available, and were shaken when these gestures produced not gratitude, but rather the flat affect of people who had learned that emotional response could be weaponized against them. In the days following the initial liberation of the Manila compound, an Army nurse named Lieutenant Sarah Chen, a Chinese-American woman from San Francisco who spoke Mandarin and some Korean, spent hours sitting with the women and slowly, painstakingly, beginning to understand the scope of what they had endured. Chen would later contribute testimony to military investigators documenting Japanese war crimes, and her field notes, preserved in the National Archives, provide one of the most detailed American accounts of the immediate aftermath of liberation. She recorded that the first breakthrough came not through words but through food. The American military distributed rations that, while monotonous to American soldiers, represented abundance and variety that the women had not experienced in years. The inclusion of items purely for pleasure, chocolate, chewing gum, canned fruit, rather than mere subsistence created cognitive dissonance. Chen noted that several women wept upon receiving a can of peaches, not because peaches held particular significance, but because the act of being given food as gift rather than as transaction seemed to short-circuit years of conditioning. The simple sweetness of peaches in syrup, consumed without expectation of payment, became a symbolic rupture in the system that had defined their existence. This recurring element, American abundance offered freely, would appear again and again in testimonies collected from survivors over the subsequent decades. Korean survivor Lee Ok-sun, speaking to researchers in 1992, recalled that what first made her believe the Americans were truly different was not their words about freedom or their promises of protection, but rather the fact that their soldiers seemed to have unlimited supplies of everything, and yet asked for nothing in return. The Japanese soldiers were always hungry, always desperate, she recalled. Even the officers. You could see it in their eyes, want and need and anger at needing. But the Americans, they had so much. They had crates of food, medicine, cigarettes, everything. And they just gave it away. I didn't understand. I kept waiting for them to tell us the price, but the price never came. This material abundance, the endless stream of supplies that American logistics brought to every theater of war, served as physical evidence of a fundamentally different political system. The women had experienced Japanese fascism as scarcity and hierarchy, as a system in which suffering was distributed downward and concentrated with maximum intensity on the most vulnerable. The American military presence, whatever its other flaws and complexities, represented a democracy's capacity to produce surplus, to have enough that sharing became possible. The chocolate bars and canned peaches were not merely food. They were arguments in physical form about the viability of different ways of organizing human society. Lieutenant Chen observed that the women's psychological recovery occurred at vastly different speeds. Some began speaking within days, tentatively at first, then in floods as years of suppressed experience found sudden outlet. Others remained silent for weeks, communicating only through gestures, existing in a twilight state between presence and absence. A few never fully returned to verbal communication, the trauma having carved away parts of personality that could not be reconstructed. Chen noted that the women who recovered fastest were often those who had been in the system for shorter periods, but this pattern was not absolute. Some women who had endured years of abuse demonstrated remarkable resilience, while others who had been captive for only months seemed irreparably broken. What unified their experience, Chen recorded, was a profound sense of shame that American caregivers found both heartbreaking and frustrating. The women had internalized the stigma that their societies attached to sexual violation, believing themselves ruined and unmarriageable, unfit to return to their families or communities. This shame, Chen understood, was itself a weapon the system had used. The knowledge that escape would only lead to social death made resistance seem pointless. Breaking through this shame, helping the women understand that they were victims rather than accomplices, that what had been done to them reflected not their own moral failure, but rather their abuser's criminality, became a central challenge of the immediate post-liberation period. The scope of the comfort station system only became apparent to American authorities gradually, as they liberated territory after territory and found women in similar circumstances at location after location. In Manila alone, investigators eventually identified 37 separate stations. Throughout the Philippines, they documented over 100. Across the entire Pacific Theater, as occupation forces fanned out through former Japanese-controlled territory, they discovered hundreds more. The system's scale suggested not aberrant behavior by rogue commanders, but rather deliberate policy implemented from the highest levels of Japanese military command. American military investigators, working alongside journalists and humanitarian organizations, began documenting testimonies and preserving evidence. The photographer Carl Maidens, working for Life magazine, took some of the first photographs of liberated comfort stations, images that would later become part of the historical record despite their disturbing nature. His photographs deliberately avoided showing the women's faces, respecting their desire for anonymity, instead focusing on the physical spaces they had inhabited, the small wooden cubicles, the bare mattresses, the walls covered with Japanese military regulations. These empty spaces, photographed in harsh tropical sunlight, communicated absence and loss more powerfully than images of survivors could have. The military trials that followed the war at Tokyo and elsewhere would eventually prosecute some architects of the comfort station system. though the coverage of these crimes was far less prominent than prosecution of more conventionally recognized war crimes. General Yamashita Tomoyuki, commander of Japanese forces in the Philippines, was convicted partly based on atrocities including the operation of comfort stations, though this aspect of his crimes received less attention than massacres of civilian populations and prisoners of war. The international legal framework for addressing systematic sexual violence in warfare was still developing. The language and concepts that would later emerge from tribunals addressing conflicts in Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia were decades away. Many women never testified at trials, never shared their stories publicly, never sought recognition or redress. The social stigma attached to sexual assault in Korean, Chinese, Filipino, and Indonesian cultures meant that survival often required silence. Women who returned to their families invented alternative histories. They had worked in factories, had been nurses, had been anywhere but where they actually had been. The shame was not theirs to bear morally, but they bore it nonetheless, because societies were not yet ready to direct that shame toward its proper recipients. Kim Sun-ok returned to Korea in 1946, traveling on a refugee transport ship that carried thousands of displaced persons home. She told her family she had worked in a military laundry facility. She married in 1952 to a man who never learned the truth. She had 3 children who grew to adulthood never knowing their mother's history. She lived with silence for 45 years, until 1991, when a Korean historian named Yoon Jeong-ok published an article calling for former comfort women to come forward and testify. Kim Sun-ok, then 64 years old, was among the first to respond. Her testimony helped break decades of silence and led to the eventual documentation of thousands of survivors' experiences. The transformation in perception occurred not just for the individual women, but for international understanding of warfare itself. The comfort stations had been designed within a particular ideological framework, one that viewed certain categories of people as less than fully human, that treated women as resources to be exploited, that embraced hierarchy and domination as organizing principles of social order. The liberation of these women and the gradual revelation of what they had endured became part of a larger reckoning with the nature of fascist ideology and its human consequences. American soldiers, whatever their own society's failings regarding race and gender, returned home having witnessed a system of oppression so stark that it clarified certain moral realities. The letters they wrote, the stories they told, the quiet horror they carried, these contributed to post-war American consciousness about the stakes of the conflict they had fought. The war in the Pacific was not merely about territorial control or geopolitical influence. It was about fundamentally different visions of how human beings should relate to one another, how societies should value or devalue different categories of people, how power should be exercised or restrained. For the women, transformation came more slowly and at enormous cost. Those who eventually testified publicly described their motivation not as seeking personal vindication. Many felt they had moved beyond the possibility of personal healing, but rather as preventing future atrocities. Lee Ok-sun, speaking at a press conference in Seoul in 1992, stated, "I am not doing this for myself. I am too old, too broken. The damage cannot be undone." But there are young women living now who might face similar situations if we do not speak. Someone must say clearly what happened, must make the world remember, so that when governments and militaries make decisions about women's bodies, there are voices saying no. There are survivors saying we have seen where this leads. This testimony took profound courage. In speaking publicly, these women violated deeply held cultural norms about female modesty and proper silence about sexual matters. They exposed themselves to social ostracism. Some were disowned by family members who felt shamed by the revelation. They endured skepticism from those who questioned whether their accounts were exaggerated or fabricated. though extensive documentation and the consistency of testimonies across thousands of survivors eventually overwhelmed such doubts. They faced political hostility from Japanese nationalist movements that denied or minimized the comfort station system, treating acknowledgement of these crimes as insult to national honor rather than as necessary historical reckoning. The symbolic object that recurs through survivor testimonies is not weapons or violence, the instruments of their oppression, but rather simple food, the peaches, the chocolate, the white bread that American soldiers shared. These items represented not just nutrition but possibility, evidence that abundance could be shared rather than hoarded, that power could be exercised through generosity rather than extraction. In a system where everything had been taken from them, where their own bodies had been declared military property, the act of receiving something freely given without strings attached represented a revolutionary reordering of social relations. Filipino survivor Maria Rosa Henson, who published a memoir in 1996, described her liberation by American forces with particular attention to a can of Spam that a soldier gave her. "I had forgotten," she wrote, "that food could be given simply because someone thought you might be hungry. Everything for so long had been transaction. You ate if you performed, you received if you complied. But this soldier, he just opened the can and handed it to me with a spoon, and when I looked at him waiting for him to tell me what he wanted in return, he just smiled and walked away to help someone else. That can of Spam. I know it sounds foolish, but it made me believe that maybe the world had not entirely forgotten how people were supposed to treat each other." The larger historical truth that emerged from the comfort station system and its liberation was about the nature of totalitarian ideology and its opposition. Fascism, whether Japanese or German or Italian, organized society around principles of domination, hierarchy, and the division of humanity into categories worthy and unworthy of moral consideration. It treated people as means rather than ends, as resources to be exploited in service of national destiny. It demanded absolute submission to authority and treated compassion as weakness. It celebrated cruelty as strength and viewed mercy as decadent softness. The American system, for all its many flaws and hypocrisies, and a full accounting must acknowledge the racism, segregation, internment of Japanese Americans, and other profound injustices that characterized American society in 1945, was built on different foundational premises. The idea that individuals possessed inherent dignity regardless of status. The principle that government derived legitimacy from consent rather than force. The belief that abundance created through democracy and capitalism should be broadly distributed rather than concentrated at the top of rigid hierarchies. The notion that strength could be expressed through protection of the vulnerable rather than their exploitation. When American soldiers liberated comfort stations throughout the Pacific, they enacted these principles, however imperfectly. They used their abundance to feed those who had been starved. They used their military power to protect rather than to prey upon. They treated women who had been systematically dehumanized as human beings worthy of care and dignity. This was not because individual American soldiers were morally superior to individual Japanese soldiers. War crimes occurred on all sides, but rather because the systems they represented embodied different relationships between power and responsibility, between strength and compassion, between the individual and the state. The women who experienced liberation carried this knowledge forward, even when they could not speak it publicly for decades. They had experienced the worst that one system could inflict, and had then been rescued by the imperfect but fundamentally different logic of another system. This direct comparison, lived in their own flesh, gave them unique insight into the stakes of political ideology, the real-world consequences of how societies organize themselves and distribute power. The aftermath of the comfort station system extended far beyond 1945. For decades, the Japanese government denied the military's role in establishing and operating the system, claiming that comfort stations had been private brothels serving military personnel, but not under official military control. This denial persisted until the early 1990s, when historian Yoshimi Yoshiaki discovered documents in the Japanese Defense Ministry archives that proved military involvement in establishing, transporting women to, regulating, and operating comfort stations. These discoveries coincided with the public testimony of survivors and led to grudging official acknowledgement, though debates about the degree of coercion and the government's responsibility continue in some quarters to this day. The legacy of the comfort stations influenced international law and human rights frameworks. The testimonies of survivors contributed to the development of legal concepts addressing sexual violence in armed conflict, culminating in the recognition of systematic rape as a crime against humanity in the statutes of international criminal tribunals. The 1998 Rome Statute establishing the International Criminal Court explicitly included rape, sexual slavery, enforced prostitution, and other forms of sexual violence as crimes against humanity and war crimes. This legal evolution occurred partly because survivors of the comfort stations refused to remain silent, insisted on recognition, and demonstrated the necessity of international legal frameworks to address such crimes. For individual survivors, the years after liberation brought varied paths. Some rebuilt lives, married, had children, and found ways to integrate their traumatic histories into coherent life narratives. Others never fully recovered, living with depression, post-traumatic stress, relationship difficulties, and the myriad ways that profound trauma reshapes personality and possibility. Many fell between these extremes, functioning in society while carrying private burdens of memory and loss. Kim Suno-kei, who finally told her story in 1991, became an activist for survivors' rights. She participated in the establishment of the Korean Council for Justice and Remembrance for the Issues of Military Sexual Slavery by Japan, an organization that provided support for survivors and advocated for official acknowledgement and reparations. She testified before the United Nations and traveled to speak at universities and human rights organizations. She devoted her final years to ensuring that what had been done to her and thousands of others would not be forgotten or denied. She died in 2004 at the age of 77, having transformed her victimization into advocacy, her silence into testimony, her private suffering into public witness. The Wednesday demonstrations in front of the Japanese embassy in Seoul began in 1992 and continue to this day, making them one of the longest-running regular protests in world history. Every Wednesday, survivors and their supporters gather to demand official acknowledgement, apology, and reparations from the Japanese government. As survivors aged and died, their average age rising from the 60s to the 80s to the 90s, the demonstrations took on additional poignancy. Each year, fewer survivors remained to attend. Each year, the historical distance from 1945 grew greater. Each year, the urgency of remembrance intensified as living memory approached its inevitable end. The compound in Manila where American soldiers found 23 women on August 15, 1945, was demolished in the 1960s during urban development. No historical marker notes its location. The women who survived that place scattered across the Philippines and Asia, most disappearing into private lives, their identities unknown. A few, years later, came forward to testify. Most carried their experiences in silence to their graves. But the act of liberation itself, that moment when the door opened and American soldiers entered with incomprehension and horror, and eventually compassion, became part of a larger story about what the war had been fought over, what had been at stake beyond territory and power. It illustrated the chasm between systems that treated people as commodities and systems that, however imperfectly, aspired to treat people as possessing inherent dignity. It demonstrated the consequences of ideologies that organized society around domination versus those that claimed to organize around consent and freedom. The peaches in syrup, The chocolate bars, the spam, the simple act of giving food without demanding payment, these became more than sustenance. They became arguments, physical manifestations of political philosophy, proof that another way of organizing human relations was possible. They represented the surplus that democracy created and the generosity that abundance enabled. They symbolized a world where strength could be expressed through protection rather than predation, where power could be used to liberate rather than enslave. In the end, the liberation of the comfort stations revealed a truth about the Second World War that extended beyond conventional military narratives of battles and strategy. The war was fought between systems that had fundamentally different answers to basic questions about human worth, about who deserved dignity and who could be exploited, about whether might made right or whether rights existed independently of might. The women who survived the comfort stations lived at the intersection of these competing systems, experiencing the worst of one and the rescue offered by another. Their stories remind us that the stakes of political ideology are not abstract. Systems of government, economic organization, social hierarchy, these are not merely theoretical constructs debated by philosophers. They have consequences that play out on human bodies, that determine who eats and who starves, who is protected and who is violated, who is treated as fully human and who is reduced to instrumentality. The comfort stations were not aberrations or excesses. They were the logical outcome of a system built on domination, hierarchy, and the belief that certain categories of people existed to serve others. The liberation was not simply military victory, but moral vindication of different principles. And the women who walked out of those compounds into uncertain freedom carried with them testimony about the stakes of that difference, about what is lost when societies embrace domination, and what becomes possible when they do not. Their silence, their eventual testimony, their complicated paths from victimization through survival to witness, these constitute an essential chapter in understanding not just what happened in the Pacific War, but what the war meant, what was being defended, and what was being defeated, what lessons about power and vulnerability, strength and compassion, freedom and oppression were written in the most intimate and traumatic terms on the bodies and souls of the women who survived. The door opened, the light came in, and the women who had learned not to hope discovered that hope had not entirely abandoned them after all. That discovery, painful and complicated as it was, remains part of the imperishable legacy of those who fought against fascism, not the soldiers alone, but all who suffered under it and lived to witness its defeat. Their stories endure as warning and as testament, as evidence of depths humanity can sink to and heights it can struggle toward, as reminder that the choices societies make about how to organize power and distribute dignity have consequences that echo across decades in the lives of those most vulnerable to their effects. In remembering them, we honor not just their suffering but their survival, not just their victimization but their witness, not just what was done to them but what they preserved despite it. The stubborn, inextinguishable human insistence that cruelty is not natural, that domination is not inevitable, that the door can open and light can enter even into the darkest places.